Right, okay, we've got watercolour paper taped down with some masking tape. I've got the Malang watercolour paints again and a medium-sized brush. So today what we're going to do is paint some very simple flowers, and I've just put some water onto the page and I'm going to let the paints do their thing. So I'm just dropping in the paints in the center of this flower and they granulate out to the edges. I'm sort of helping them a little bit, pushing the paint along as I go, but not worrying too much about it at all. Just keep dropping that colour in and spreading that paint out. So moving on to the second flower, and again, same process, putting the water down, grabbing some paint. I love the way it mixes there from the first flower, and adding some pinks in and spreading that colour around. So you're just layering up, adding some additional pigment because you want the centre of your flowers to be the most pigmented and the edges to look a bit pale and a little bit, fluffy and light like flowers are. And just continuing, adding some other colours on top of the colours already put down. It looks a bit scruffy at the moment, and I wouldn't really worry about it because we're going to be able to change this into some beautiful little flowers. Adding some leaf textures there, just an indication of leaves, and just putting them wherever I feel is appropriate on this page. So once I've done that, I'm just going to go round the flowers a little bit with a bit of this green, and then I'm going to let the page dry. Once your page is dry, you're going to add some more colour. So it's just again doing the same process, getting your pigment and moving that around the page, keeping the darkest pigment in the centre of the flowers, and then grabbing some water on your brush and moving that paint around. And you can see that it gives that look that middle is quite densely coloured and the edges are very papery like flowers are. So I've got a thinner brush here and I'm outlining the edges of these flowers just to give them a bit of definition. You could do this with a brush or you could do it with a pencil or maybe a pen, whatever you feel is appropriate for you, whatever you've got to hand. So again, I'm just outlining the flower, grabbing some water onto my paintbrush and letting that paint sort of mix in. So going around the center again, I want to get a real dark color in the center and adding some pinks in here. And then I'm grabbing some salt and I'm liberally putting some salt onto those centers and letting that give a lovely texture for us to work with. So I've got my Primacolor pencils and I'm going to do some colouring in now. Just make some definition to these flowers, colouring in the centres, colouring around the edges and just giving it a little bit more depth. So it's more or less scribbling, adding those layers in and sort of defining some of those petal shapes there. I'm using Primacolor pencils just because they were easy to grab, but you could use any pencils. They don't have to be expensive. They could just be very cheap pencils. They're going to give the same effect here. So outlining the leaves and just putting some shapes in there, the veins in those leaves there, and scribbling round the edges just to give them a bit of shading, make them look a little bit more realistic. And then grabbing a pinky colour to give a little bit more depth around those edges and scribbling sort of like in a circular motion, just going round and round until I feel that I'm happy with that. Using these paler colours for the centres and bringing out some stamens just to give it a bit of highlights on that dark, and I think that works kind of well. and going round the edges again in a scribbly kind of way, just to make it look a little bit different, one flower from the other. So I've got these cute little squeegy bottles and I've filled them with acrylic paint, and I'm just going to dab some little dots into the centre. So I've got a dark purple here, and then with the dots that I've dotted in, I'm sort of dragging that paint out so that they look like stamens coming from the centre of that flower. I've got a bit of gold and I'm doing the same process, squeegeeing that out, and I'm going to be dragging that out again. And I've also got a white which I'm going to do the same process with. If you haven't got these little bottles, don't worry. What I suggest you do is get a very fine little paintbrush and just dab that paint on. Give the same effect, and maybe you could get a toothpick or something to drag that paint out. Very similar effect. You wouldn't notice that any difference once your painting is done. So this is very enjoyable. I love using acrylic paint and these little bottles, dabbing it on, putting some little dots here and there. Looks a bit uniform, I think, but we'll adjust that in a minute. So just putting some more dots here and there, and it just gives that look of pollen being dusted off from the wind and floating away. So what I've done here is I got a piece of paper and I squashed it on top because I thought that the dots just looked all the same size, and I think now they've got a bit of variance there. So I've picked up white acrylic paint pen and I'm outlining some of those splodges that I've put there, and then adding some detail in the middle. So nice little dots in there, and then I've got a gold uniball pen, and again same process, circling some of those dots and adding some stamens to the flowers. So when you've done that, I've grabbed a gold felt tip pen and I'm just going to do the edges, just outside the edges, just to make that lovely frame around my picture. And I think gold complements because I've already used gold within the picture. And then I'm going to heat up the tape and peel it away, and just being very careful not to rip my page, and just pulling it off and then bringing it up to the camera for you to look at. So you can see the lovely detail here, and I think it's turned out quite well, especially for a painting where all it is dropping in bits of paint and adding some acrylic little dots. I think it's turned out well.